I was a judge. That meant I held the lives and freedoms of other men in my hands. I sent men to prison. I sentenced men to hang. And I did these things with the certainty that I was acting justly, that the law I applied was fair and right. How could I then ask that same law to treat me differently? How could I ask for mercy when I had shown none to others? How could I claim that justice applied to everyone except myself? I could not. And so I asked for the sentence I deserved, the sentence I would have imposed on anyone else who did what I did. Judge Morrison showed me mercy despite my request, and I must accept his judgment as I expected others to accept mine. But I want you to know that I did not seek that mercy. I did not earn it. It was given to me as a gift I did not deserve. Remember this, the law must be the same for all men, or it is the law for no man. Justice that bends to accommodate the powerful is not justice at all, but merely another form of tyranny. Whatever else I failed at in my life, I hope I succeeded in showing you that principle. The letter continued for several more pages, discussing his love for them, his regrets, his hopes for their futures. But it was this passage about justice and equality under law that would be quoted in legal journals and court decisions for generations to come. Robert Augustus Harper was transported to the Virginia State Penitentiary in Richmond on January 15, 1877. The facility was a grim fortress of brick and iron, designed in the 1820s and overcrowded with men convicted of everything from theft to murder. Harper was prisoner number 2417. He was assigned to work in the prison's shoe factory, stitching boots 12 hours a day alongside forgers, thieves, and killers. By all accounts, he was a model prisoner. He caused no trouble. He made no complaints. He performed his assigned labor with the same diligence he had brought to his judicial duties. Other prisoners initially viewed him with suspicion, a former judge in their midst, but Harper's quiet dignity and refusal to claim any special status gradually earned him a measure of respect. He received regular visits from Elizabeth and the children, though the distance made such visits infrequent. Elizabeth never remarried, despite social pressure and financial hardship. She raised their 3 children alone, working as a seamstress to supplement what little money Harper had been able to save before his conviction. The children grew up bearing the weight of their father's crime and his unusual response to it. Harper's case became something of a legal legend. Law schools debated it. Newspapers wrote editorials about it. Some praised him as a man of principle who had held himself to the same standard he held others. Some condemned him as a fool who had thrown away his life and abandoned his family for the sake of abstract ideals. Some argued that his self-conviction was itself evidence of temporary insanity, that no sane man would argue so forcefully for his own execution. But the legal community largely came to view Harper's case as an extraordinary example of judicial integrity. The Virginia Bar Association passed a resolution acknowledging his unprecedented adherence to the principles of equal justice under law. Several law review articles were written analyzing his trial testimony and its implications for judicial ethics. His letter to his children was reprinted in legal textbooks as an illustration of the philosophical underpinnings of the rule of law. In prison, Harper did something surprising. He began teaching. Other prisoners, many of them illiterate, asked him for help reading and writing. Harper organized informal classes, teaching basic literacy and, for those interested, basic legal principles. The prison administration, recognizing the value of this work, eventually formalized it, creating the prison's first educational program with Harper as its head instructor. Years passed. Robert Jr. grew up to become an attorney, dedicating his practice to representing indigent defendants, men who, like his father, needed someone to ensure the law was applied fairly. Margaret became a teacher, never marrying, devoting her life to education and carrying her father's legacy of service in a different form. William, too young to remember his father as a free man, none the less grew up with the weight of the Harper name and became an advocate for prison reform. Harper himself aged in captivity. His hair turned completely silver. His face became lined and weathered from years of hard labor. But his mind remained sharp, and his spirit, while burdened by guilt, never completely broke. He continued teaching. He continued writing letters to his children, letters full of wisdom and regret in equal measure. He never applied for parole, just as Morrison had predicted. On September 12, 1896, 20 years to the day after he entered the Virginia State Penitentiary, Robert Augustus Harper walked out a free man. He was 63 years old, stooped but not broken, with eyes that had seen the inside of justice from both sides, and found it wanting in ways he could never have imagined as a young judge. Elizabeth was waiting for him at the prison gates. She was 54 years old, her auburn hair now gray, but she stood as straight as she had on their wedding day nearly 30 years earlier. They embraced without words, and then they walked together to the rail station for the journey home to Lexington. Harper lived another 8 years as a free man, though he never practiced law again. His conviction had stripped him of that right. He worked as a clerk in his son's law office, offering quiet advice but never appearing in court. He spent time with his grandchildren, though he would sometimes grow distant, his mind returning to that night in 1876 when everything changed. He died on April 3, 1904, of heart failure at the age of 71. His funeral was attended by hundreds, including judges, lawyers, former prisoners he had taught, and members of the Caldwell family who had long since forgiven him, if not forgotten what he had done. He was buried in the Lexington Cemetery under a simple headstone that read, Robert Augustus Harper, 1833 to 19 Taus, and for judge, teacher, servant of the law, no mention of his crime, no mention of his punishment, just the facts of his service, which in the end had taken many forms. The story of Robert Augustus Harper remains a disturbing reminder that justice, for all our systems and procedures, ultimately depends on the integrity of individual human beings, and that human beings are fallible creatures capable of both terrible violence and extraordinary moral courage, sometimes embodied in the same person. But questions remain, echoing through the decades since that October night in 1876. Was Harper's insistence on his own conviction an act of genuine principle, or was it punishment driven by overwhelming guilt? Did he truly believe in equal justice under law, or was he seeking martyrdom as a form of redemption? And perhaps most troublingly, if he had been allowed his request for execution, would that have been justice, or merely another crime compounding the first? The law, we like to believe, is objective, blind, impartial. But the Harper case reveals the uncomfortable truth that law is always administered by people, with all their passions, prejudices, and personal philosophies. Judge Morrison's decision to show mercy despite Harper's request was itself a form of judgment, a decision that the law should serve human flourishing rather than abstract principle, that compassion has a place even in the courtroom, that sometimes the most just sentence is the one that acknowledges complexity rather than demanding symmetry. To this day, Harper's case is taught in legal ethics courses, discussed in judicial training programs, and debated in law review articles. His name appears in footnotes of Supreme Court decisions discussing judicial conduct and the principle of equal justice under law. The letter to his children has been reprinted in countless anthologies. His story has become larger than the man himself, transformed into a parable about accountability, integrity, and the weight of conscience. And on certain autumn evenings in Lexington, when the air carries that particular crispness that promises winter, when the shadows lengthen across Washington Street, locals sometimes pause near the old Harper House, now divided into apartments, its picket fence long since replaced. They remember, or they've heard the stories from those who remember, about the judge who sentenced himself to death and the mercy he received despite his protests. The courthouse where he presided still stands, its brick facade weathered but solid. In one of its halls hangs a painting of the circuit judges who served Rockbridge County, and among them is Robert Augustus Harper, forever 40, 3 years old, his eyes painted with an intensity that seems to follow viewers as they pass. Students and lawyers sometimes stop before that painting, reading the small plaque beneath that tells his story in abbreviated form, and they wonder, what would I have done? How would I have judged myself, and would I have had the courage, or the folly, to demand my own execution? If this journey through one of history's most extraordinary cases of conscience and consequence has resonated with you, if you find yourself pondering the nature of justice and the price of principle, then consider subscribing to the Untold Hour. There are many more stories waiting to be told, mysteries buried in time that deserve to be examined with the respect and depth they require. Leave a like if this account provoked reflections that go beyond mere entertainment, and comment sharing your own perspectives on this question. Can a person truly judge themselves, or do we all require mercy we haven't earned? Until next time, remember that history's darkest corners often reveal our brightest principles. Welcome to this journey through one of the most extraordinary cases of justice and conscience in American legal history. Tell us where you're watching from now, because this story will challenge everything you believe about judgment, redemption, and the price of a single moment's rage in a way few other accounts can. We're about to delve into a mystery that haunted the Commonwealth of Virginia for generations, where a respected judge defied all precedent and left a legacy so profound that legal scholars debate its implications to this very day. It was the year 1876. America was celebrating its centennial, 100 years of independence, with grand exhibitions in Philadelphia showcasing the nation's progress. Alexander Graham Bell had just demonstrated his revolutionary telephone. The country was healing from the wounds of the Civil War, though Reconstruction still cast its shadow across the South. In Virginia, the situation was particularly complex, a former Confederate state struggling to rebuild its identity, its economy, and its systems of justice. The Blue Ridge Mountains stood, as they always had, ancient and indifferent to human affairs. Their peaks caught the first light of dawn and the last rays of sunset, casting long shadows over the valleys below, where small communities clung to tradition even as the world around them transformed. These were places where a man's word still meant something, where honor was currency, and where the law was often whatever the most powerful men in the county decided it would be. But in Rockbridge County, in the shadow of those eternal mountains, the law had a face. His name was Robert Augustus Harper. Judge Harper, a name that commanded immediate respect in every courthouse, every tavern, every church pew from Lexington to Natural Bridge. He was 40, 3 years old that autumn, a man in the prime of his life and career, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that had seen both the horrors of war and the hope of peace. To understand what happened on that October night when everything changed, you must first understand the world that shaped Robert Harper. You must walk the dirt roads of post-war Virginia, breathe the air thick with coal smoke and possibility, and recognize that justice in 1876 was not the abstract concept we study in law schools today. It was personal, it was immediate, and sometimes it was written in blood. Rockbridge County in the autumn of 1876 was a place caught between two worlds. The Old South, with its rigid hierarchies and Confederate memories, still lived in the hearts of men who had worn gray uniforms and charged across smoke-filled battlefields. The New South, promising industry and reconciliation, beckoned from the rails of the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway that now cut through the mountains like a steel promise of progress. The county seat, Lexington, was a town of approximately 3,000 souls, dominated by two institutions that seemed to embody this tension: Washington College, where Robert E. Lee himself had served as president until his death 6 years earlier, and the Virginia Military Institute, which had sent its cadets to fight at New Market and still trained young men in the art of war and discipline. The brick buildings stood solid and red against the green mountains, symbols of tradition that refused to crumble. In this world moved Robert Augustus Harper, a man whose very presence commanded attention. He was not tall, perhaps 5 feet 9 inches, but he carried himself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His face was clean, shaven in an era of elaborate beards, revealing a strong jaw and a mouth that could shift from warmth to severity in an instant. His voice, witnesses would later recall, was deep and measured, the voice of someone who chose words carefully because he understood their weight. Harper had been born in 1833 to a family of modest means in nearby Beaufort County. His father was a farmer who had worked himself into an early grave, leaving young Robert to fend for himself at 15. But the boy had possessed something his father lacked: ambition tempered by principle. He had read law under an established attorney, spending his evenings by candlelight memorizing Blackstone and Virginia statutes, while his hands were still dirty from a day's manual labor. The war had interrupted his ascent. He had enlisted in the Confederate Army in 1861, serving with distinction, but without particular heroism. He was not a man who sought glory on the battlefield. Instead, he served as a quartermaster and occasional legal advisor to his regiment, applying his growing legal knowledge to the mundane but necessary work of military justice. When he returned to Lexington in 1865, he was 29 years old, with a reputation for fairness and an unshakable sense of duty. His rise through the legal profession was steady rather than meteoric. He married Elizabeth Thornton in 1867, the daughter of a local merchant whose fortunes had survived the war intact. She was a quiet woman, witnesses recalled, with auburn hair she wore in the severe style of the period and eyes that seemed to see more than she ever spoke. They had 3 children by 1876, Robert Jr., age 8, Margaret, age 6, and baby William, barely 2 years old. Harper had been appointed to the circuit court bench in 1874, at the relatively young age of 41. It was a position of immense authority. Circuit judges in Virginia traveled between counties, presiding over cases that ranged from property disputes to capital murder. They were, in many ways, the embodiment of law itself in communities where legal institutions were still rebuilding after the chaos of war and Reconstruction. By all accounts, Harper was a fair judge, stern, certainly, uncompromising in his adherence to procedure. But fair. He sentenced criminals with appropriate severity and showed mercy when the law allowed. He treated black defendants with the same judicial consideration as white ones, which in 1876 Virginia was notable enough to draw both praise and criticism. Some called him progressive. Others muttered that he had forgotten which side had won the war. But there was something else about Robert Harper, something that those who knew him well could sense beneath the judicial robes and formal speech. A darkness, a shadow that crossed his face when he thought no one was watching. Perhaps it was the war men who had seen what he had seen rarely escaped without scars, visible or otherwise. Perhaps it was the weight of the position itself, the burden of holding other men's lives and freedoms in your hands, of knowing that your words could send a man to the gallows or set him free. Or perhaps it was something more personal, a weakness he kept locked deep inside himself where no one could see it until the night when the lock finally broke. The Harper home stood on Washington Street, a two-story frame house painted white with green shutters, surrounded by a picket fence that Elizabeth kept meticulously maintained. There was a small garden where she grew vegetables and flowers, and a stable in back where Harper kept 2 horses, a black gelding for his circuit travels and a gentle mare for family use. It was a respectable home, neither ostentatious nor humble, exactly what one would expect for a judge of modest means. But respectability is often a mask we wear for the world. Behind closed doors, in the private spaces where we become our truest selves, darker truths can lurk. The autumn of 1876 was particularly beautiful in the Blue Ridge. The leaves turned gold and crimson in waves that swept down from the peaks, and the air carried that peculiar crispness that promises winter but doesn't yet threaten. Harvest had been adequate, if not abundant. The political situation remained tense. Virginia was still under federal oversight, though Reconstruction was unofficially dying. But locally, life had settled into new rhythms. Judge Harper was preparing for the October session of court, reviewing case files in his study by lamplight, when the first signs of trouble appeared in his life like cracks in a dam that would soon burst catastrophically. His name was Thomas Caldwell, and he represented everything Judge Harper despised about the new Virginia struggling to be born from the ashes of the old. Caldwell was a carpetbagger in all but name, a Northern-born businessman who had arrived in Rockbridge County in 1873 with capital to invest and an absolute certainty that Southern ways were backward and inefficient. He was 35 years old, thin as a rail, with the kind of nervous energy that made him difficult to be around for extended periods. He spoke rapidly, gestured constantly, and had opinions about everything from railroad development to agricultural reform to the proper role of government in rebuilding the South. He had purchased the old Dawson Mill on the outskirts of Lexington and converted it to steam power, bringing in machinery from Pennsylvania and hiring workers at wages that undercut traditional arrangements. The local establishment viewed him with suspicion that bordered on hostility, but Caldwell had one powerful asset. He was making money. His mill processed lumber faster and cheaper than any competitor, and even men who hated him personally found themselves selling him timber. The conflict between Harper and Caldwell had been building for months before it erupted into violence. It had begun innocuously enough, a property dispute involving a right of way that Caldwell needed to expand his mill operations. The land in question bordered Harper's property, a small tract he had inherited from an uncle and had planned to develop himself someday. Caldwell had approached him with an offer to purchase the right of way, an offer Harper had politely declined. Caldwell had not taken the refusal well. He had increased his offer. Harper had declined again. Caldwell had then gone to the county board, arguing that the right of way should be granted through eminent domain for industrial development. Harper, using his legal expertise and personal influence, had blocked the maneuver. What had begun as a business disagreement evolved into something more personal. Caldwell began making public statements about entrenched interests blocking progress. He implied, without quite stating directly, that Harper was using his judicial position to enrich himself and his cronies. He wrote letters to Richmond newspapers describing corruption in Rockbridge County, letters that everyone knew were about Harper, even if they didn't name him. For his part, Harper maintained his dignity in public, but those close to him noticed changes. He became shorter, tempered with his children. He drank more in the evenings, though he was never drunk. Elizabeth watched her husband with increasing concern, but when she broached the subject, he dismissed her worries with a curt reassurance that everything was under control. Everything was not under control. The explosion came on October 19, 1876, at approximately 8 o'clock in the evening. The location was the Lexington Hotel's dining room, a public space where respectable men gathered for supper and conversation. Harper had been dining alone, working his way through a plate of beef and potatoes while reviewing notes for an upcoming case, when Caldwell entered with several associates. What happened next would be reconstructed from multiple witness testimonies, though accounts varied in certain details. What remained consistent was this: Caldwell, emboldened by whiskey and the presence of his supporters, approached Harper's table. He did not sit. He stood over the judge, close enough that Harper would have to crane his neck to look up at him. A deliberate power play. Still blocking progress, Judge Harper. Caldwell's voice carried across the dining room, ensuring an audience. Or have you finally decided to stop acting like you own this entire county? Harper set down his fork with deliberate precision. Mr. Caldwell, this is neither the time nor the place for such discussion. If you have grievances, you may address them through proper channels. Proper channels. Caldwell laughed, though there was no humor in it. You mean the channels you control, the system you've rigged in your favor. Everyone knows what you are, Harper. You're just another Confederate has been clinging to power while the world moves forward without you. The dining room had gone silent. Even the kitchen noises seemed to have stopped. Every eye was on the two men, the judge seated calmly, the businessman looming over him, both their faces flushed with anger barely contained. Harper stood. He was not a large man, but witnesses later recalled that he seemed to expand in that moment, filling space with pure presence. Mr. Caldwell, you will leave this establishment immediately, or I will have you removed. You'll have me removed. Caldwell stepped closer, his face now inches from Harper's. His breath stank of whiskey and rage. By what authority? You're not in your courtroom now, Your Honor. You're just another man, and not a particularly impressive one. What happened next took perhaps 3 seconds, but would be replayed in Harper's mind for the rest of his life. Caldwell shoved him, not hard. A contemptuous push against Harper's chest, the kind meant to humiliate rather than injure. But something in Harper snapped. The dam broke. Years of maintaining judicial composure, of swallowing insults, of watching men like Caldwell prosper while better men struggled, of feeling his authority questioned and his honor impugned. It all erupted in one terrible instant. Harper's hand went to his waist, to the small revolver he carried, as many men did in 1876, Virginia, for protection on his circuit travels. The gun cleared the holster. Caldwell's eyes widened, his body beginning to pull back, but he was too close, too slow, too drunk to evade what came next. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. The flash illuminated the dining room like lightning. Thomas Caldwell staggered backward, his hand going to his chest, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Blood spread across his white shirt, black in the dim lamplight. He fell, his body hitting the floor with a sound that was both heavy and hollow. For a moment nobody moved. The gun smoke hung in the air, acrid and thick. Harper stood frozen, the revolver still extended, staring at what he had done. His face, witnesses would later testify, showed no anger in that moment, only horror, only the dawning realization of a man who had just crossed a line from which there could be no return. Caldwell's associates rushed to their fallen companion, but it was immediately clear that nothing could be done. The bullet had struck him directly in the heart. He died there on the floor of the Lexington Hotel dining room, his blood seeping between the floorboards, while Judge Robert Augustus Harper stood over him with a smoking gun and a future that had transformed from promising to catastrophic in the space of 3 seconds. Someone went for the sheriff. Someone else went for a doctor, though it was already too late for medicine. Harper did not move. He did not resist when Sheriff William Doyle arrived and quietly asked for the weapon. He handed it over without a word, his hands steady, his face a mask that revealed nothing of the storm raging behind his eyes. "Robert," the sheriff said gently, they had known each other since childhood, "I'm going to have to place you under arrest." "I know," Harper replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know what the law requires, William. I know better than anyone." They took him to the county jail, a squat brick building that Harper had visited countless times in his judicial capacity. He had sentenced men to be held within its walls. Now he walked through its door as a prisoner himself, charged with the murder of Thomas Caldwell, facing the same justice he had so often dispensed to others. The irony was not lost on him, nor was the horror of what he had done. As the cell door closed behind him with an iron finality, Harper sat on the narrow cot and buried his face in his hands. Outside, in the streets of Lexington, word was already spreading. Judge Harper had killed a man. The pillar of legal authority had become a murderer. The questions came fast. Would he be tried fairly? Who would preside over his case? What would happen to the county's judicial system if its judge was convicted? And most urgently, what sentence awaited a man who had built his career on the impartial administration of justice? The days following the shooting moved with the inexorable momentum of a boulder rolling downhill, crushing everything in its path. Elizabeth Harper came to the jail the morning after the shooting. The matron on duty, Mrs. Henderson, a widow who had known the Harpers socially, allowed her into the cell block, though she kept a discreet distance. Elizabeth stood outside her husband's cell, her hands gripping the bars, her face pale but composed in that way women of her generation had perfected, suffering transformed into dignity through sheer force of will. "Robert," she said softly. He looked up from where he sat on the cot, still wearing the same clothes from the night before, now wrinkled and stained with Caldwell's blood. In the morning light streaming through the high window, Harper looked older than his 43 years. Lines that had been barely visible the day before now seemed carved into his face. His eyes, those eyes that had commanded such authority from the bench, looked hollowed out. "Elizabeth, you shouldn't be here. The children are with my sister." She interrupted, her voice steady. "Robert, tell me what happened. Tell me the truth." So he did. He told her everything, the mounting pressure, the public humiliation, the shove, the rage that had consumed him like fire. He told her how in that moment he had forgotten every principle he claimed to hold dear, had become nothing more than an animal responding to threat with violence. He told her that he remembered pulling the trigger, remembered the look on Caldwell's face, remembered the sound of the body hitting the floor. He remembered all of it with terrible clarity, and he knew he would remember it until the day he died. When he finished, Elizabeth was crying silently, tears running down her face, though her expression remained composed. "What will happen now?" she asked. "The law will happen," Harper replied, as it should. What happened over the following weeks was unprecedented in Virginia legal history, a situation so unusual that it drew attention from newspapers as far away as New York and Charleston. The legal question was straightforward yet complex. How do you try a circuit judge when that judge has jurisdiction over his own case? The Virginia Code of 1876 contained provisions for judicial misconduct and recusal, but nothing quite fit this situation. Harper could theoretically recuse himself, but that would require another judge to be appointed, and the nearest available judge was in Lynchburg, presiding over his own heavy docket. The Commonwealth's attorney, a man named James Rutherford, who had practiced before Harper numerous times, found himself in an impossible position. He had to prosecute a man he respected, a man who had shown him nothing but professional courtesy, a man whose legal knowledge far exceeded his own. The preliminary hearing was held 2 weeks after the shooting, in the same courtroom where Harper had presided over countless cases. But now Harper sat at the defendant's table, and Judge Timothy Morrison from the Augusta County Circuit had been temporarily assigned to hear the preliminary matters. Morrison was 60 years old, silver-haired and solemn, and he approached the situation with visible discomfort. This was not a case any judge wanted. The preliminary hearing established the basic facts that no one disputed. Harper had shot Caldwell. Caldwell was dead. The question was not guilt. Harper himself admitted to the shooting, but rather the legal classification of the act. Was it murder, or was it manslaughter? Was it premeditated, or was it a crime of passion committed in the heat of the moment? Witnesses testified to Caldwell's aggressive behavior and Harper's attempts to defuse the situation. They described the shove, the quick draw, the single shot. Some witnesses, those sympathetic to Harper, emphasized Caldwell's provocations. Others, particularly Caldwell's associates, painted Harper as a man who had been looking for an excuse to eliminate a business rival. Throughout the proceedings, Harper sat silent and attentive, watching the machinery of justice process his case with the same thoroughness he had always demanded. He took notes occasionally. He conferred quietly with his attorney, Marcus Fleming, a younger man who had trained under Harper himself and now found himself defending his mentor. Fleming's strategy was clear: argue for manslaughter rather than murder, emphasize the provocation, request mercy from the court. It was a sound legal approach, the same approach Harper would have recommended had their positions been reversed. But Harper himself seemed disengaged from his own defense, as though he were watching proceedings that concerned someone else entirely. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Morrison ruling that sufficient evidence existed to bind Harper over for trial on the charge of second-degree murder, a compromise position that acknowledged both the killing and the lack of clear premeditation. The trial was scheduled for January 1877, giving both sides time to prepare. Harper was released on bond, a substantial sum posted by friends and colleagues who still believed in him despite everything. He returned to his home on Washington Street, but it was not a homecoming. He was a ghost haunting his own life, moving through rooms that had once felt warm but now seemed cold and foreign. His children looked at him with confusion and fear. Elizabeth tried to maintain normalcy, but normalcy had been shattered beyond repair. Harper spent those weeks before trial in his study, surrounded by law books, preparing for a trial that would determine his fate. But he was not preparing his defense. He was preparing something else entirely, something that would shock even those who thought they knew him well. December passed in a blur of winter gray. Christmas came and went with muted celebration. Harper attended church services where the minister carefully avoided any mention of the upcoming trial, though everyone present thought of nothing else. The new year arrived 1877, bringing with it the date Harper had been dreading and perhaps, in some dark corner of his soul, anticipating. The trial began on January 9, 1877, on a Monday morning when the temperature had dropped below freezing and frost covered the courthouse windows. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with spectators standing along the walls and spilling into the hallway. This was the most significant trial Rockbridge County had seen in decades, possibly ever. Judge Morrison presided again, having agreed to continue with the case through trial. The jury had been selected from the county rolls, 12 white men, as was the law, ranging in age from 25 to 60, 3 representing farmers, merchants, and tradesmen. They sat in the jury box with faces that revealed nothing, knowing that the weight of history rested on their shoulders. Commonwealth's attorney, Rutherford, presented his case methodically. He called witnesses who described the shooting. He introduced the revolver as evidence. He painted a picture of a man who had let his temper overcome his judgment, who had used lethal force in a situation that did not warrant it, who had committed murder regardless of the provocation. Fleming, for the defense, called his own witnesses. He emphasized Caldwell's aggression, his public campaign against Harper, his drunken state on the night of the shooting. He argued that Harper had acted in the heat of passion, that he had been physically assaulted. The shove constituted assault under Virginia law, and had responded instinctively. He reminded the jury that Harper was a decorated Confederate veteran, a respected jurist, a family man who had served his community with distinction for decades. It was a competent defense, perhaps even a winning defense. Several jury members appeared sympathetic, nodding at key points. The case for manslaughter rather than murder seemed strong. And then, on the third day of trial, Robert Augustus Harper did something that no defendant in Virginia history had done before or has done since. He took the stand in his own defense, not unusual in itself, and began his testimony calmly enough, confirming the basic facts of his life and career. Fleming led him through a series of questions designed to establish his character and the context of the shooting. Harper answered each question carefully, his voice steady, his demeanor professional. But then Fleming asked a routine question. "Judge Harper, in your professional opinion as someone trained in the law, how would you characterize your actions on the night of October 19th? Harper paused. The courtroom waited in silence. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room. "In my professional opinion, Mr. Fleming, I committed murder." The courtroom erupted. Fleming looked stricken. Judge Morrison gavelled for order. The jury leaned forward in their seats, uncertain they had heard correctly. When silence was finally restored, Fleming attempted to redirect. "Your Honor, I believe my client misspoke. I did not misspeak." Harper interrupted, turning to face Judge Morrison directly. "If I may continue." Morrison, after a long moment's hesitation, nodded. Harper stood from the witness chair and walked to the center of the courtroom, positioning himself before the bench in the exact spot where he had stood countless times as judge. He was, witnesses later recalled, completely composed. His hands were steady. His voice was clear. He had made a decision, and he was seeing it through with the same determination he had brought to every other significant action of his life. "I have spent the last 3 months reviewing the law concerning homicide in the Commonwealth of Virginia," Harper began. "I have read every relevant case, every statute, every judicial interpretation. I know this law better than anyone in this courtroom because I have applied it from the bench for the past 3 years, and I can tell you without equivocation that what I did on October 19th constitutes murder under Virginia law. Fleming was on his feet. Your Honor, I object. Overruled. Morrison said quietly, "Let him speak." Harper continued, his voice gaining strength. Thomas Caldwell was unarmed. He shoved me, yes, but a shove is not deadly force. Under Virginia law, deadly force may only be used in response to deadly force or the imminent threat thereof. I was in no danger of death or serious bodily injury. I was in a public place surrounded by witnesses. I could have walked away. I could have had him arrested for assault. Instead, I chose to kill him. He paused, looking at the jury, then at the spectators, then at his wife in the front row. Elizabeth's face was wet with tears, but she met his gaze without looking away. But more than that. Harper said, "I want to explain what happened in my mind in that moment, because the law recognizes that intention matters. When Caldwell shoved me, I felt rage, pure, incandescent rage, and in that rage I wanted him dead. I pulled my weapon with the conscious intention of ending his life. I aimed at his chest, the deadliest target. I pulled the trigger knowing exactly what would result. This was not an accident. It was not instinct. It was a choice, however brief the moment in which I made it." Rutherford was frantically taking notes, hardly believing what he was hearing. A defendant was making the prosecution's case better than the prosecutor ever could. Now, Harper continued, "My attorney will argue that I acted in the heat of passion, and there is truth to that argument. The law recognizes heat of passion as a mitigating factor that reduces murder to manslaughter, but the law also establishes criteria for that mitigation. The provocation must be adequate. The response must be reasonable, and there must be no cooling off period." He pulled a document from his pocket, a legal brief he had prepared himself. "I have prepared an analysis of heat of passion doctrine as applied to my case. In it, I conclude that while Caldwell's behavior was provocative, it was not adequately provocative under the law to justify a lethal response. A reasonable person, which the law requires me to be, would not have responded with deadly force to a shove in a public dining room." Judge Morrison leaned forward. "Mr. Harper, do you understand what you're doing?" "I understand perfectly, Your Honor. I am applying the law as I would apply it to any defendant who came before me with these facts, and the law is clear. I am guilty of murder." Fleming was visibly distraught. "Your Honor, I request a recess to confer with my client." Denied. Harper said firmly, "Your Honor, I am exercising my right as a defendant to testify in my own defense. My attorney cannot prevent me from telling the truth." Morrison looked like a man trapped in a nightmare. "Mr. Harper, I strongly advise you to reconsider this testimony." "With respect, Your Honor, I have already considered it thoroughly. I spent 3 months considering it, and I have reached my conclusion." He turned to the jury. "Gentlemen of the jury, I will not insult your intelligence by pretending I am anything other than what I am, a murderer. I took a human life without legal justification. The fact that I was a judge does not place me above the law. Indeed, it places me more firmly under the law's authority, because I swore an oath to uphold it." He returned to the witness stand and sat down. "I have one more thing to say, and then I will rest." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the sounds from the street outside seemed to have ceased, as though the entire world was holding its breath. "If this case had come before me," Harper said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "if I were sitting where Judge Morrison sits now, and the defendant were anyone else with these facts, I know exactly what I would do. And so I ask this jury to render the verdict that justice requires, without regard to my position or my past service. The law must be applied equally, or it means nothing." He looked directly at Morrison. "And when that verdict comes, I ask your honor to sentence me according to the law. Virginia law is clear regarding the sentence for murder, death by hanging. I request that this sentence be imposed and carried out without delay." The courtroom exploded into chaos. Morrison gavelled repeatedly, calling for order. Fleming collapsed into his chair, his head in his hands. Elizabeth sobbed openly, supported by her sister. The jury sat stunned, their faces showing the same mixture of shock and horrified fascination that gripped every person in the room. Robert Augustus Harper had done the impossible. He had convicted himself from the witness stand and requested his own execution. The trial could not continue in any meaningful way after Harper's testimony. Fleming attempted to present mitigating witnesses, but their testimony seemed hollow in the face of Harper's own admissions. Rutherford gave a brief closing argument that mostly summarized what Harper himself had said. The whole proceeding had taken on a surreal quality, as though everyone present had stumbled into some dark theatrical production where the normal rules of reality did not apply. Fleming's closing argument was passionate but futile. He argued that Harper's obvious remorse and willingness to accept responsibility should count for something. He reminded the jury that mandatory death sentences for murder had been the subject of reform debates. He begged them to show mercy to a man who was clearly suffering more than any external punishment could inflict. Harper sat through it all with the same composed expression he had worn on the bench. He did not react when Fleming invoked his children, now facing life without a father. He did not flinch when the prosecutor, in his rebuttal, quoted Harper's own words back to the jury. He simply waited for the verdict he knew was coming. Judge Morrison's instructions to the jury were careful and thorough. He explained the legal definitions of murder and manslaughter. He outlined the standards for heat of passion. He reminded them that a defendant's own testimony, while certainly evidence, was not conclusive. They could reject it if they believed it was motivated by excessive guilt or temporary insanity. He gave them every possible avenue to find a lesser charge. The jury retired to deliberate at 3 o'clock on the afternoon of January 11, 1877. Harper was taken to a holding cell to await their decision. Elizabeth was allowed a brief visit, but their conversation was private, witnessed only by a deputy who stood at a respectful distance. The jury returned after only 2 hours. This was significant. In cases where juries spent days deliberating, there was usually hope for acquittal or a compromise verdict. 2 hours suggested consensus, and consensus in this case could mean only one thing. The courtroom reconvened as twilight settled over Lexington, the windows showing the deep blue of approaching night. Lamps were lit, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Harper stood as the jury filed in, their faces grave. None of them would meet his eyes. "Gentlemen of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" Judge Morrison asked. The foreman, a farmer named Samuel Whitfield, stood. His voice shook slightly as he spoke. "We have, Your Honor. What say you?" "We find the defendant, Robert Augustus Harper, guilty of murder in the second degree." A collective exhale moved through the courtroom, though whether it was relief or resignation was impossible to say. Second-degree murder, not first-degree, which would have required proof of premeditation, not manslaughter, which Harper himself had argued against. A middle ground, acknowledging both the killing and the circumstances that led to it. Morrison addressed Harper directly. "Mr. Harper, the jury has found you guilty of murder in the second degree. Under Virginia law, I have discretion in sentencing for this offense. The sentence may range from 5 years to life imprisonment, or in cases of particular gravity, death. Do you have anything to say before I impose sentence?" Harper stood. His voice was steady, clear, final. "Your Honor, I request that you impose the sentence of death." Morrison closed his eyes briefly, as though in pain. "Mr. Harper, the law does not require. The law requires justice." Harper interrupted. "And justice requires that I receive the same sentence I would have imposed on any other defendant with these facts. I have taken a life. The law demands a life in return. I ask that you impose that sentence and that it be carried out according to law." Morrison looked at the man before him, a colleague, a fellow member of the bar, someone he had respected for years, and saw something in Harper's eyes that made him hesitate. This was not the request of a man seeking martyrdom or making a dramatic gesture. This was the request of someone who had weighed himself in the scales of his own justice and found himself wanting. "Robert," Morrison said quietly, abandoning formality, "the law gives me discretion for a reason. I could sentence you to a prison term, your children. My children will remember a father who stood by his principles even when those principles condemned him." Harper replied, "That is a better legacy than a father who preached justice but sought special treatment when justice turned its gaze upon him." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Morrison looked at the jury, at the spectators, at Fleming, who sat with his head bowed. He looked at Elizabeth Harper, who had stopped crying and now watched her husband with an expression that contained something between pride and devastation. Finally, Morrison spoke. His voice carried the weight of a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. "Robert Augustus Harper, you have been convicted by a jury of your peers of the crime of murder in the second degree. You have requested that I impose the sentence of death, after careful consideration of all factors, including your service to this community, your obvious remorse, and your unprecedented willingness to hold yourself accountable under the law." He paused, and in that pause, the entire trajectory of Harper's remaining life hung in balance. "I cannot in good conscience comply with your request." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Harper's face showed the first real emotion since the trial began. Surprise, followed quickly by something like disappointment. Morrison continued, his voice growing firmer. "The law gives me discretion in sentencing precisely for cases like this, where strict application of maximum penalties would result in injustice. You have asked me to treat you as I would treat any other defendant, but the truth is that you are not any other defendant. You have shown remorse that most defendants do not show. You have held yourself accountable in ways that most defendants never would, and you have children who need their father, even if that father must serve time for his crime." He leaned forward, looking directly at Harper. "I sentence you to 20 years hard labor at the Virginia State Penitentiary. You will be eligible for parole after serving 10 years, though I suspect you will serve the full sentence because you will refuse to seek parole, but I will not take your life, Robert. The law allows me this discretion, and I will use it." Harper stood motionless for a long moment. Then, to the surprise of everyone in the courtroom, he spoke again. "Your Honor, I respectfully request that you reconsider. The law is what I say it is in this courtroom." Morrison interrupted, his voice sharp for the first time, "And I have rendered my sentence. This court is adjourned." The gavel fell with a finality that echoed through the room. Deputies moved to take Harper into custody for transport to Richmond and the state penitentiary. As they led him away, he turned one last time to look at Elizabeth, at his children who sat beside her. Robert Jr. trying to be brave, Margaret crying into her aunt's skirts, baby William too young to understand any of it. "I love you," Harper said, the words barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak, her hand clutching the locket at her throat that contained his photograph. Then he was gone, led through a side door to the jail where he would spend one final night before the long journey to Richmond. The spectators filed out slowly, speaking in hushed tones about what they had witnessed. Some praised Morrison's mercy. Others argued that Harper should have gotten his wish, that a murderer, even a remorseful one, deserved death. The debate would continue for years. That night, alone in his cell, Harper wrote a letter to his children. It was found among his papers years later, after his death, and was eventually donated to the Virginia Historical Society, where it remains to this day. In it, he attempted to explain to his children why he had done what he had done, not the murder itself, which he called my eternal shame and sin, but rather his conduct at trial. My dear children, the letter began, by the time you are old enough to read and understand this, I will have been gone from your lives for many years. I do not expect your forgiveness, for what I did to Mr. Caldwell is unforgivable, but I hope you will understand why, having committed that terrible act, I could not then compound it by hiding behind my position or seeking special treatment under the law I had sworn to uphold.